Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on plastics in the Great Lakes, an update on the science and discussions on future cleanup efforts. This is the final installment of a four-part webinar series presented by the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus, examining some of the critical policy issues related to the Great Lakes. My name is Derek Cantu. I'm a policy analyst here at the Midwestern Office of the Council of State Governments. And one of our roles here at CSG is to provide staff support to the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Legislative Conference. And on behalf of all the caucus members, we are pleased to welcome you to this to this afternoon's webinar. Before we get started, let's briefly review a couple of items that are pretty standard. First, a reminder that today's webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the recording will be made available on the caucus website. Second, we ask that you please mute yourself and mute your audio to help reduce background noise while our presenters are giving their information. And third, we hope that this will be an interactive session, so please be ready to participate in the discussion or ask questions following our guest presentations. For that, please feel free to place your questions or comments in the Zoom chat feature or use the raise your hand function during Q&A portions. Many of you have been active in the work of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus for a long time, but as a reminder to all, and for the benefit of those who may be joining us for the very first time, the caucus is a binational, nonpartisan network of state and provincial legislators representing the 8 U.S. states and 2 Canadian provinces that share the Great Lakes Basin. The caucus is dedicated to promoting the protection and restoration of the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River, and is led by an executive committee that includes legislators from every state and province in the region. The current chair of the caucus is Illinois Representative Robin Gable, and the vice chair is Minnesota Representative Jennifer Schultz. Membership in the caucus is free and open to any legislator in the region who wishes to participate. You may find a list of current members on our website, greatlakeslegislators.org, and if you wish to join us, you can sign up online as well. Today's webinar will be taking a look at the phenomenon of plastic and microplastic waste entering into the Great Lakes system. For those of you from Illinois, you may have seen a spread that appeared last year in Crane Chicago Business about this problem and how plastic pollution can wind up in some unexpected areas, such as the food we eat or the water we drink. 2 of the sources referenced in that feature story will actually be presenting to us today. This session will explore the science around Great Lakes plastic pollution and policy steps lawmakers can take to try and stem the flow. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into our first speaker. Our first speaker today is Dr. Sam Mason, Director of Sustainability at Penn State Erie, the Behrend College. For years, Sam has led pioneering research analyzing the effects of plastic and microplastic pollution, and that has specifically been on the Great Lakes region and its impact on the environment and people. Her work has been featured in major media outlets, including the New York Times, NPR, and the BBC. In 2015, her work helped to form the foundation of what would eventually become the Federal Microbeads Free Water Act that was signed into law by President Barack Obama. If that wasn't enough, Sam also holds the title of having swam across Lake Erie, which, dang, that's an accomplishment. Sam has a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from the University of Texas, Austin, and a PhD in Physical Chemistry from the University of Montana. She's here today to provide an overview of recent updates in Great Lakes microplastic pollution research. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm trying to share my screen, and once we get that started, there we go. So you should all be able to see my screen. As I said, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here and talk with you all about Great Lakes plastic pollution. So I'm going to focus in on a lot of the data and the science that has occurred over the last decade that we've been doing this work. We being, me and my colleagues, but I always have to set the stage. So in case you aren't aware, there has been an exponential increase in plastics production since World War II to the point where we have now produced 10 billion metric tons of this material, basically since its advent about 70 years ago. I always, one of the classes I teach is actually a math class, and I'm always like, when you have a really big number, you have to put it in human terms. So following the advice I give to my students, exactly how much is 10 billion metric tons? It is equivalent to 1 million Eiffel Towers or 100 million blue whales, just to provide some, perspective of what that it's such a huge number, what that actually means. What has happened to all of this plastic that we have manufactured? Of that 10 billion metric tons, about 30% of it is still in use. But that means that 70% of it has been generated as waste. Some of that, about 10% of it has been recycled. More of it has actually ended up being incinerated in order to create energy, with the vast majority of it being discarded. I know over the years, there's been a few studies that have come out that have kind of been, I think, spun a little bit in the media. So should you think that all of this plastic is somebody else's problem, there's this really incredible report from the National Academy of Sciences that came out just earlier this year. The United States has produced more plastic waste than any other country. While we only have 4.3% of the world's population, we have produced 2 to 8 times more plastic waste per capita than as compared to many other countries. A total of 42 million metric tons of that waste that has been generated specifically from the United States. So just really want to put this, kind of in our lap, as opposed to thinking that this is somebody else's problem. Of the plastic waste that has been discarded, current estimates are somewhere between 10 to 15% of it has actually ended up in our environment, with, real focus on our waterways. And, a lot of attention has been paid to the oceans, and that is actually where this, research into plastic pollution started. But the reality is, as we're moving forward and understanding this issue, that the real issue of plastic pollution comes upstream from the oceans, and it's making its way to the oceans through freshwater systems. Should you think this last image is in like Bangladesh or something? Nope, that's Erie, Pennsylvania. I took that picture at one of the 2 litter booms that we have in town. Looking at actually a pretty minor river with regard to the Great Lakes, but a major river that flows through the city of Erie, just to give you some perspective. So that's kind of, setting the stage. What I want to share with you guys today in terms of the science, I'm going to start with the beach survey, since that's really where this work started. Talk about our open water surveys, and then move upstream into the rivers, then back out into the lakes, but this time in the sediment, before talking briefly about biota and then human consumables. It's a lot of information to share in a short amount of time. So obviously I'm not going to, it's going to be kind of a 30,000 foot view, but hopefully provide some really important information for you all to take back to the work that you're doing. So as I mentioned, beach surveys are really where this work started. The first, publication on plastic pollution within the Great Lakes was Patricia Corcoran's group looking at the beaches of Lake Huron. And this image here, although it was taken from a second study that she did, same kind of results that she found. What was really interesting here was that she found a high amount of these pre-production plastic pellets that are otherwise known as nurdles. The highest concentration was found at the southern beach of Sarnia Beach, and then decreasing. So it's the dark area in the pie charts as you moved northward. This study was early, but it really highlights some things that are still true. One, pre-production plastic pellets tend to be very common microplastic that we find, and lake currents tend to move them through the Great Lakes system. There are 18 chemical facilities listed in the Canadian National Pollutant Research Database of companies specializing in the production of plastics within the Sarnia area. And so it's these corporations that are releasing these pre-production plastic pellets that then she was finding on the beach. 2 interesting studies that have come out kind of more recently, looking at community science data. This first one was looking at data from the Alliance for the Great Lakes. Found, so looking at 5 specific beaches on Lake Michigan, found that most of the debris was related to activities from people on or near the beach. And then a more recent study looking at Ocean Conservancy ICC international coastal cleanup data from 2016 to 2018. You see the biggest kind of blobs here coming from these, kind of more urban locations, Thunder Bay and Chicago, Erie, and Toronto, as you move throughout the Great Lakes system. And then what they found in this is, again, it's very similar to what you saw in the Alliance for the Great Lakes. The vast majority of the debris is coming from people doing things on or near the beaches. But you see number 2 here, this tiny plastic or foam, really kind of representing the contribution, of plastic that is moving through the Great Lakes system, and really kind of highlights what we end up seeing in our open water surveys, where the vast majority of the plastic that we pull out of the open lake are these really small plastic particles, otherwise known as microplastics. And so it really kind of indicates and gets to the knowledge gap area that I talk about at the end, the fact that a lot of degradation or breakage of plastic is happening on the land before it makes its way out into the water. And once you're talking about something that's micro-sized, cleaning it out of the water is going to be exceedingly difficult, if not impossible. And so when we're looking at policies to really deal with this problem, you have to be looking upstream from the lakes themselves. But what have we found within the open waters of the Great Lakes? Starting up in Lake Superior, we find an average. So this is, I don't even know, 7 different studies that have come out averaging over these 7 studies. We see in Lake Superior an average of 30,000 plastic particles per square kilometer of the lake surface. As we go into Lake Huron, that increases up to 46,000. In Lake Michigan, the average is 17,000. In Lake Erie, it goes up to 160,000. And then in Lake Ontario, we're at basically 250,000 pieces of plastic per square kilometer across the lake surface. So when we account for the surface areas of the lakes, we have somewhere between 1 billion and 5 billion pieces of plastic strewn across each of our 5 Great Lakes at any point in time. 97% of these particles of plastic are what we call microplastics. So particles that are less than 5 millimeters in size, by definition, are considered microplastics. 75% of these are between 1/3 of a millimeter and 1 millimeter in size. So truly micro-sized particles, really, really small. Only 2 studies have looked at particles less than 1/3 of a millimeter in size, that 333 micron size range. And we find even more as we go to smaller sizes, right? And that makes sense. One big plastic bag can form millions of microplastics and billions of nanoplastics, just by the nature of the material. Some of these are what we classify as primary microplastics. So those pre-production plastic pellets that we were talking about in the beach surveys, as well as microbeads. But most of them are probably classified as secondary microplastics. That is, that they came from the breakdown of something that was larger. So litter becoming fragmented through the photooxidative degradation pathway. Fragments are the most common type of material or plastic particle that is pulled out of the Great Lakes. With fibers being the second most common in the upper Great Lakes. So if we're looking at Lake Superior, Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, fibers tend to be the second most common or the first most common. In Lake Superior, actually, fibers are the most common type. In the lower Great Lakes, so Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, fragments are top, with pellets being the second most common type of microplastic pulled out of the Great Lakes. Really kind of giving you an indication of sources of where these things are coming from. As we move from the lakes into the rivers, we see that So this was a study that we did looking at 29 major tributaries to the Great Lakes, representing about 20% of the flow into the Great Lakes, and looking across different land covers, hydrology, all different kind of parameters that we used in determining the 29 tributaries that we would look at. We find that we have much higher concentrations within the rivers as compared to the Great Lakes. In many ways, this isn't a surprise. You're closer to the people, which are the ultimate sources of the plastics, but also there's less water for the dilution of those plastics. What was really interesting and kind of surprising us is the difference in the morphologies that we found, much higher concentrations of fibers within our rivers, our tributaries, as compared to the Great Lakes. When we kind of dive into this data in a little bit more detail, so we're looking here at correlations between the morphologies that we were talking about and land use as well as hydrology in these bikes charts. I know they're kind of busy, so we're going to break this down a little bit. The blue colors represent non-urban or more rural conditions. The red colors represent urban conditions. The lighter shades represent low flow conditions. And the darker shades represent high flow or runoff, conditions, precipitation events, basically. And then we have our different morphologies at the top. And what we see consistent across almost all of the morphologies is that as we move from rural to urban environments, the counts increase. And as we move from low flow to high flow, the counts increase, right? So we see this with fragments, we see this with foams, we see this with films like paper or like plastic bags. And we see this with, though it's more difficult to ascertain, we see this also with pellets. What this really kind of indicates is that the main contributor of these particles to these tributaries is coming from urban runoff. We do not, however, see this with the fibers. It was basically a flat line. It didn't matter if we were rural or urban, low flow or high flow, we just always saw fibers, really kind of indicating that the fibers are probably primarily getting into the water through atmospheric deposition. And I think that this is also why we see such high counts of fibers in Lake Superior because of the large surface area of Lake Superior. We wanted to look at this in more detail. We were really surprised by the high numbers of fibers in comparison to what we saw in the lakes. We see all these fibers in the rivers, so we were kind of curious as to why that was. And we had a hypothesis that we tested out in a study that we did in the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewer District area. So we looked at 3 major tributaries to Lake Michigan that flow through the city of Milwaukee. And we collected samples as we moved down the stream. As we moved downstream and the stream got deeper, we tested at different depths as we looked down the river, so down the water column, and as we moved out into the lake. So the areas that are circled, we were able to collect them at multiple depths. And we did this through this kind of nested system, right? So for all samples, we collected the surface or that zero net. As we got to deeper areas, we would add in additional nets looking down the water column. And the point of this is that we suspected that basically the hydrology of the river was keeping these fibers afloat, which is why we saw the high counts in the rivers. But then as the rivers flow into the lake, you see these fibers settling out and ending up in the lake sediment. And that is exactly what this study kind of bore out. So if we look at the subsurface, we see the higher concentrations of fibers as compared to the water surface itself, showing that the fibers are starting to subside or settle as the turbulence of the river flows. Kind of adding to this, when we look at the polymers that are more dense, that are less dense than water, we see that they tend to be preferentially at the water surface, whereas polymers that are more dense than water tend to end up in the sediment layer. I know you see the blue foam area in the water. In the sediment, this tends to be these tire particles that we found, very different than what you see on the water surface, which tends to be styrofoam. And just to kind of add into this, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on lake sediment, but you see that kind of orangey area, again, kind of adding to the fact that mostly what you find in the lake sediment are these fibers within that have settled out. So as the tributaries flow into the lake, these fibers settle out and you tend to find them preferentially in the lake sediment. That was really quick into the lake sediment, but I don't really spend a lot of time on that. So looking at the biota, this is one of these knowledge gap areas. To date, there's only been 6 studies that have come out within the Great Lakes on biota, 3 on fish, 1 on mussels, 1 on cormorants, which is a bird that exclusively eats fish, and 1 on algae. What we see from these studies is that fibers are the most common morphology of plastic particle within the fish and the cormorant. And then this really interesting study looking at different fish over time. So this came out of the Holian Lab in Loyola, Chicago. And what you see is basically that you don't see any plastic prior to World War II. And as we move from World War II and that exponential increase in plastics production, you see them showing up in these archived fish as well. Again, with fibers dominating. Fragments tend to dominate in mussels, and fibers tend to dominate in these algae studies. This just came out last year, showing that basically algae kind of almost as a net kind of catch fibers and they actually absorb onto the surface. So some pretty interesting studies coming out there. And then of course, if plastic is in our water, it comes back to us, right, through the food that we eat. So just kind of a real quick a snapshot. So this was a great review article that came out in 2019, did a review of all these studies that have looked not just in the Great Lakes region, but across the world, looking at different things that humans consume and the amount, averaging across to look at the amount of plastic within these items. The biggest contributor of plastic into a diet would be coming from bottled water. And the studies have shown that it's the bottling of the water that is contributing most of the plastic to that product, right? So it's not coming necessarily from the water itself, right? You see tap water there has an average about 4 particles per liter of tap water. Bottled water ends up more at 95 particles per liter. And it's that act of packaging the product that leads to the vast majority of that plastic in that product. So real quick, I know that was a real quick kind of overview of the science to date. So to try and summarize that, in terms of the ultimate sources of plastics, right? Mismanaged waste or litter is a primary source. I do want to mention when I'm talking about this that I think it's important to be aware that about half of plastic that is litter is not intentional littering. These are what the studies have shown. A lot of it, about half of it is, people putting something in a garbage bag and it, putting that out at the curb and an animal tearing open that bag and it being released, or thinking that you're throwing something away and that it blows out of a trash can, right? There's a lot of unintentional littering that happens. So it's not just people throwing stuff out of their car window. It's just simply the reality that some of our trash doesn't end up where we intend it to be. Industrial sources are another common type of plastic pollution source, right? So we talked about the nurdles or pre-production plastic pellets. I didn't have a chance to mention the fragments, but those are oftentimes they're carved off of products in the manufacturing. Textiles, and then in-use products, right? So things coming off of tires when we're driving, the microbeads that were commonly found in many consumer products prior to the Microbeads Free Water Act. So these are the ultimate sources of the plastic, and then it's making its way into our waters through various pathways, runoff being the dominant form, the dominant path to move plastic from the land out into the water and the oceans, with a contribution of that to being wastewater, but a smaller contribution relative to just urban runoff. Rivers are a major pathway moving plastic from land out into the oceans. And what is lesser known is the contribution of atmospheric deposition to this whole kind of mass balance pathways. So on that note, kind of some knowledge gaps, we still have a little ways to go in kind of understanding major pathways of plastic movement, such as that atmospheric deposition. A lot that we need to do in terms of getting data to help us with the mass balance models, right? So if you've seen in the litter or in the kind of public sphere, they'll often talk about this missing plastic between the amount that we know we've produced and what we actually find in the water. There's some kind of contribution that hasn't been accounted for. Addressing environmental compartments with little data. I already mentioned the air, but also the biota that we talked about earlier that we still don't know a lot about. Still a lot of questions with regard to the degradation of plastics in the environment. We know that on the land, we tend to see a lot of macro items, right? Bags and bottles, but out in the water, it's mostly microplastic. So there's a lot of breakage of this material as it's making its way from the land into the water. And then the ecological impact. While we know that this stuff is in consumables, we know it's in people, we don't really still know. We still have a lot of questions with regard to what is the actual impact that it's having on us when we eat and drink and inhale all of these microplastics. And with that, hopefully I kept to my time pretty well. Thank my funding agencies and then open it up for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mason, for the incredibly comprehensive presentation that you gave. We're going to go ahead and open up for questions. I will actually go ahead and kick it off if that's all right.
Yeah.
You talked about there being limited research out there that has actually taken a specific look at plastic pollution in the Great Lakes. And I just wanted to ask, why do you think that is the case? Because the Great Lakes are something that impacts billions of dollars in industry and trade. I would think that there'd be more people that'd be interested in how plastic is going to impact that.
With regard to the biota, I think it's we were at kind of the front end of doing things initially. When you're kind of paving the way, funding sources are difficult to get. So we have some big research groups that are now kind of starting to get funded and doing some really important work. But I do think that funding has been an issue that it's starting to be addressed, I think, at this point. But I think early on, funding was a real issue. And kind of this, with the way that some of the funding that I saw initially coming out, asking these really big questions that when really what we needed were some pretty basic studies, right? We're not going to be able to do a comprehensive ecosystem level assessment, when we're still trying to understand how plastic is degrading. And so sometimes it was a mismatch between what was kind of expected and the level of science, right? We had some really basic questions that we still needed to ask, but that's not the way that the RFPs were written. And so, but I think that is starting to change. I think they're coming more in line. And it just takes time. Sometimes, the funding that initially came out were pretty like 2-year C grant. There's not a whole lot you can do in 2 years. You're not going to be answering these like ecosystem level kind of questions in a 2-year study. It's going to take longer time to get at that. So we really needed to see some funding coming through different pathways with longer timelines, I think. So
absolutely. Do we have any other questions for Dr. Mason? And again, you feel free to put your questions in our chat feature or just use the raise your hand option as well.
I did such a great job. There's no questions. That's good.
Well, I had another one that I'll go ahead and ask, and so while people are still maybe thinking about their question.
Yeah.
I've been seeing a lot of research and a lot of publication too about the acidity of water and the effects that it can have on the environment. They're being seen in the Antarctic and other places. Has there been, and I apologize if you mentioned this already, but has there been any research about how the acidity of water in the Great Lakes is maybe impacting the breakdown of plastic bottles or plastic in the Great Lakes, and how much that's going to turn into, how quickly it's going to turn into microplastic?
I suppose there could be some, but I mean, we often store, really strong acids in plastic because it tends to be pretty resistant to acidity. So I don't think that that's the biggest kind of driver. The biggest driver to the degradation, and I almost hate to use that word because it makes it sound like biodegradation. Really, we're talking about breakage. That the main way that plastics get smaller is mechanical. I just went out to our site for the first time, right, since December because of winter, and they freeze over the winter. I went out there yesterday and was really quite shocked, and I shouldn't be at this point. I've done this for 10 years, but you have winter up here and it makes things cold and it makes things brittle and they break, right? That's, I think, a bigger driver to the degradation of plastics than, say, the acidity of the water. So I went out to, one of our litter boom sites yesterday and was really shocked. Had a good number of macro items, bags and bottles, but not really that much more than I normally collect, say, in a week in the summer. The biggest difference was the amount of, it was confetti, just the amount of plastic. So I hadn't been out to the site in 3 months. And it was just, there was so much microplastic that had collected in our litter boom over those 3 months. It was kind of shocking. So I think it's more the freeze thaw cycle of winter up here that's leading to much more of that breakage of plastic that's happening on land before it makes its way into the water. And so I think that's just really important for legislatures, I think, to know, because you're not going to solve this by sticking something out in the Great Lakes. You got to be doing it on land. We really have to think much more holistically, I think, about the way that we deal with trash. I keep putting out there that I will be the trash czar for the United States if Biden calls on me. So if anybody here has Biden on speed dial, let him know that I'm offering.
Be the trash czar. I like it. We have any other people who wanted to ask a question this time? And if you don't have one right now, we are going to have the Q&A near the end of our session too.
I will stick around. I'm looking forward to what Andrea has to say.
All right. Well, then, thank you again, Sam, so much for your presentation. We will go ahead.
Oh, somebody raised their hand.
Yes, Representative Troy from Ohio. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just, and eliminating a lot of this plastic infusion into our waterways and into our Lake Erie here. What do we see in other states? Every time we have local communities who are on the waterfront and they try and control this by, banning the use of plastic bags in the grocery stores, or, trying to legislate, I guess, or prohibit certain plastics from being used, especially the trash bags. There's a big pushback, I know, from the state legislature here in Ohio that just preempts these local ordinances and says, no, you're forbidden to do this because this is, anti-economic development or something like that. I mean, are any states having any success in trying to control some of these things legislatively?
I think the bottle bills have been hugely successful. I live in Pennsylvania where we don't have a bottle bill. And I can tell you the number one thing I'm finding in our litter booms are bottles, plastic bottles. And I think if I was in New York or Michigan, I wouldn't see that. So I think there's a lot of place. And that's why I said I was really excited to hear Andrea speak on the policies, but I think there's a lot of place for policies to be put into place to make significant changes. I think, unfortunately, COVID short-circuited a lot of policies that had been put into place. So we're seeing more plastic in our waterways because of COVID, because bag bans were put on hold for a long period of time. And you see an increase in people getting groceries delivered and takeout food and all the personal protective equipment, and we're seeing it in our water. So there's no doubt that COVID has led to more plastic pollution. But I do think there is quite a bit of room for policies that can have a significant impact on what we're finding in the water.
Thank you.
Before we move on, we do have one more question too from Representative Pat Boyd from Indiana. In addition to the amounts of plastics, are we also considering the EDCs, or the endocrine disrupting chemicals in plastics?
Yeah, no, I didn't have a chance. I mean, which is sad because I'm a chemist and I'm actually really interested in plastic pollution because of the chemistry angle. But I didn't have a chance to talk, the real reason, I think one of the main reasons we're worried about plastics in the environment is not so much the plastic itself, although studies are showing that does actually have an impact at the cellular level. But the bigger concern for me has always been the connection to endocrine disrupting chemicals. So the reality is that a particular piece of plastic, that you have around you is anywhere from 30 to 70% of that item is not actually polymer. It's all of those chemicals that are mixed in. So over 300 different chemicals that are mixed into these products: plasticizers, flame retardants, UV stabilizers, colorants, all sorts of chemicals that are mixed in that process that are not chemically bound and have been shown to leach out. In addition to the fact that, they pick up chemicals as they're out in the environment, things like polychlorinated biphenyls and polyaromatic hydrocarbons. And so when these things are ingested by, say, a fish, a frog, or a human, it's bringing all of those chemicals with it. So yeah, there's a lot to be studied on that kind of ecotoxicological impact of plastic pollution. Absolutely. And it's a big reason why this should be a concern. And the United Nations has ranked this second to climate change in its impact on human health and our ability to survive as a species. And that's because of those chemicals. Yeah.
Thank you. And we need to move on to our next segment at this point, but continue putting your questions into the chat and I promise you we will get to them. So again, thank you so much, Sam, for that great presentation.
I will stick around to the end.
All right, our next speaker is going to be Andrea Densham. She is the Senior Director of Government Affairs and Conservation Policy at the Shedd Aquarium here in Chicago. Andrea possesses over 20 years experience in public policy research and advocacy. And before coming to the Shedd Aquarium, she served as Vice President of Government Affairs and Public Health at Prevent Blindness America, was Executive Director of the Child Care Network of Evanston, Illinois, and Director of HIV Services for the City of Chicago. Andrea has a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Massachusetts and a Master of Arts in Political Science from the University of Chicago. She's here today to talk about and provide some policy recommendations lawmakers can take to address plastic pollution in the Great Lakes. So at that point, Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I don't see the sharing happening quite yet. So I will wait for it. Oh, there you go. There it is. Fantastic. Thank you. It is so wonderful always to go right after Dr. Mason because we are so well aligned on the conversation and this and I think I'm going to jump in right away to begin with that intersection between climate and plastic pollution. There's really more than just about what happens when the plastic becomes microplastic. While that's incredibly important, going upstream and thinking about how it's produced and that relationship between the petroleum and the polymers and the amazing diversity of that the chemical additives, which are the ones that many of us are especially concerned about. Let me give you a little bit of an overview of what we do at Shedd, and then we'll jump right in. So, you probably, some of you who haven't heard me talk before might be a little bit surprised that Aquarium is engaged in this. My CEO, by the way, is a chemist, so she goes into depth on polymers, which I can't always keep up on, but I try. And we are really deeply committed to making sure that we are protecting and making even more healthy wildlife and the wild places they call home, as well as making it safe for all of us and all of our communities, not only here in the Great Lakes, but across the world. So we work hard to protect and restore the Great Lakes, empower people, advance equity, and making sure that that's front and foremost. And happy to talk to anybody about Justice 40, an initiative federally here in the United States we've been really working hard on. Ensuring that amazing scientific knowledge like Dr. Mason's really is utilized when and it's the lens through which we design our policy. And we want to ensure that there is a healthy and vibrant ecosystem and neighborhoods for the next generation. And so you can see we use science as our North Star. We try to make sure that we're equity rooted and impact focused as we do our work. In terms of prioritization of our work, we work on climate solutions, trying to save biodiversity, including aquatic life and the places they call home, those wild places, trying to increase the amount of safe, healthy habitat for aquatic life, advancing equity, and building a sustainable future. We work between ocean and freshwater, we try to be the bridge between marine science and marine policy and freshwater and Great Lakes policy. And we work really hard with coalitions on both sides and elected officials and policymakers and agencies on both sides of not only the borders, but also on both between marine and freshwater. So 2 core groups of our work are saving biodiversity and building a sustainable future. You see what those issues are. Preventing pollution is core to the work we do. Reducing plastic pollution is one element. We also work on things like moving towards regenerative agriculture and trying to reduce the amount of pesticides and nutrients in our waters, and reduce the amount of PFAS and other pretty substantial toxins that have a really negative impact both on humans and on aquatic life. Clearly everyone here understands how important our Great Lakes are and streams and riverways. I always think it's important for us not just to think about the big, beautiful lakes, which are just through that wall from here, but also the rivers and streams that are deeply connected. And Dr. Mason's talk, I think, talks about why those things are so important, especially in this topic. So, and also it's really, I don't need to tell you any more than Dr. Mason just did about why, but what the science is, and that the science is really clear. We're also are very clear that we need to act now. And the relationship between climate and plastic pollution and some of the other toxins that are associated in both production and in waste are really critically important. There's a great piece in The Atlantic I encourage you to think about and take a look at. I'll send along a number of the links to these things. Also, just this month, there was the beginning of a international plastic pact. It is moving in the right direction. It means that this has become a very high-level priority for all of our countries that are engaged in the UN negotiations, and it is directly tied to the UN discussions around climate. Those 2 things cannot be pulled apart, partially because how we produce plastic is by using petroleum-based, high carbon-based items, but also because of the really negative impact, both on human and aquatic life and terrestrial life for that matter. We're also seeing, and then, that impact, and then this is just to go on about that impact of harm, we're learning more and more about the more we research it. And while the negatives are really hard and challenging and can be depressing, and they're real, and the issue of those chemical additives, I think, are actually something that has been really underappreciated, and one that I'm hoping in the coming year and years that we can focus more on, because I think in terms of both human and aquatic life impacts, it may be one of the largest ones, as well as the general impact that the petroleum production that's used inside has. But there are solutions. We can move towards simple things like reuse this is a little metal can that drinking my water out of, as opposed to a plastic bottle, moving towards sustainably produced items, regenerative ag seems like it's not related to plastic pollution, but we may be able to find solutions to some of the objects that we create that really also move us towards, especially those of us in the bread baskets of both of our countries, can really help our small and medium-sized farmers move forward. So I think there's some interesting solutions there that we need to look into. And it obviously decreases our carbon footprint. So I have the true honor to work with a number of extraordinarily amazing scientists and policy leaders. That includes my colleagues at Monterey Bay and Dr. Margaret Spring, who was the chair of the committee that just released their report that Dr. Mason was just talking about. It's a very important report. It was a blue ribbon panel of incredibly smart scientists that gave us a really nice blueprint of where we need to go next. I will again share this with all of you, but I say this to say that the urgency was clear as day, and the blueprint was also clear. You know, reducing plastic pollution, coming up with sustainable substitutes, decreasing waste, improving waste management, and minimizing sea disposal. One of the first things that they think we need to have is a national strategy, and we have to increase the quality of our data. Our colleagues in Canada have been doing the same work, except they're a little in front of us. They did a really amazing scientific assessment in 2020, and then just this year have released, and it just closed on March 5th, a guidance across Canada on how to select alternatives to single-use plastics and other regulatory oversight suggestions. And some of those findings really highlight that the substance itself is toxic and needs some regulation, and that we need to think about how we go upstream to move away from the production of especially the single-use items, find sustainable substitutes, and really move us in a different direction so that we don't have to go downstream to be cleaning all of this up. And as you can tell from my intro, I did public health work for 20 years. Let me tell you, it costs a lot less if we prevent harm than it does to clean it up. And that is especially true in this space. And I really am trying to encourage our policy solutions to go upstream to the preventing the harm before it happens. I also, because this is a binational group and it is not often that I get to have this nerdy conversation, but as many of you know, we have multiple binational agreements about our fantastic bodies of water that are the Great Lakes. One of them is the Great Lakes Water Agreement, and that water agreement talks about and prioritizes that the waters be free of pollutants. And it is a really interesting potential tool in our toolbox to try to jointly work together to regulate and reduce the amount of plastic pollution and other toxins that are in our waterways. We're going to be having more discussions about this in the coming year. I encourage all of us to think about, and especially you all who are legislators, and some of you who sit on some of the bodies that we're going to be looking at this regulation, to look at Annex 3, think about chemicals of mutual concern, and consider microplastic and the additives that are often made in making microplastics, as well as PFAS, which we know is one of the top priorities to be thought of as we update the water agreement and ensure that we're protecting the Great Lakes, not just for us, but for the next generation. And I really do think we need to take lessons from PFAS. I'm from Michigan, that's where I grew up. A lake that I swam in when I was 3 years old, as the story was told to me, is now unswimmable because of the amount of contamination from PFAS. We know that that there are chemicals that have substantial harm. PFAS is one of those examples of really long-standing harm, right? I'm in my 50s, so think about how long ago some of the pollution was happening. It was happening while I was a kid. And now my daughter will not be able to swim in the same waters that, and nor would a grandchild if she had one. So, and although we hope to clean it up, the cost of cleanup is way too substantial. So one thing I want to focus on here is the importance of monitoring and regulation. If we can't monitor it, if we don't know that it's there, it's really hard to regulate. And this is also a lesson learned. We learned the hard way in the public health world. So I really encourage us to think about what tools we already have, Our waste treatment and water treatment systems are a great place for that kind of work to happen. Our colleagues in California, the California EPA has been doing just that kind of early work to try to figure out how best to monitor microplastics through their water treatment systems. And they have one really fantastic plan that they just announced this past about a month ago, maybe 2 months ago. And it's a great way for them as a state. And I would encourage our other provincial and state EPAs to think about how they too can do that. The last thing I'll say about monitoring is that we've learned a lot, and wastewater is that we've learned a lot through COVID about how quickly we can use new technology to track things and have a really good impact on public health. I'd love us to do that when it comes to plastic as well. The other thing that we've learned from PFAS is the importance of holding producers responsible so that they change how their products are created so that they don't cause the harm to humans and aquatic and terrestrial life. Right now, the burden of plastic waste ends up almost entirely on the shoulders of municipalities, small and large alike. But it is especially hard for those smaller ones who don't have a lot of infrastructure. And for those folks to try to deal with the mass of single-use items in particular, it becomes especially hard for them. So I do want to note, and I hadn't highlighted it here, but again, because I'm from the great state of Michigan, as much as I love living here in Chicago, one of the things that we learned in Michigan long time ago is that bottle deposits work, and they work really well. I'm from Ann Arbor, and let me tell you, despite the 100,000 plus people that come to our football games, there are no bottles left because they're worth 10 cents. 10 cents is enough to incentivize people and to create microeconomies to keep things moving. There are lots of solutions like that that are well tested, well designed, and can have a great impact. The other way is to incentivize manufacturers to move away from toxic products, to regulate the production and manufacturing. Senator Durbin at the federal level in the United States has a great bill that we've been working really hard with him, which is a plastic pellets bill that we were hoping we could learn from the micro beads bills that were successfully passed, and try to make sure that those folks who are creating the pre-production pellets have the responsibility to keep them contained and keep them out from our local waters and into the air. To strengthen state and provincial EPA equivalents, to ensure they have enough staffing and oversight and powers to regulate these items, and then hold producers responsible. I don't know if any of the colleagues from Minnesota are on the call, but there's a really interesting and well-designed EPR bill in Minnesota. And colleagues in British Columbia in Canada have outlined a whole bunch of lessons learned that they've learned from early on from their EPR bill. And one of the most important things is to ensure that the equivalent, I think it's Environment Canada, that there was concerns about weakening controls and oversight. And I think what's most important from the lessons learned that I've heard so far is keeping the EPAs strong at our state levels, making sure they're well staffed, that they have a little regulatory oversight of the items and of the substances that cause the greatest harm, and that we allow them to go and hold producers responsible. And that, in my experience, often if you can have conversation with manufacturers and ensure that they understand what the harm is, that they will quickly pivot to something else. I'll tell a really quick story here. We had years ago at Shed plastic water bottles and plastic soda bottles, and we went to the distributor and said we wanted them to be in cans, in aluminum cans. They said, no, they couldn't do it. We found out from other colleagues at other aquariums that we worked closely with that they could do it in other states. And they still said, no, they couldn't do it. It wasn't until we started purchasing water in boxes that within 3 months, they were able to figure out how to get them in cans. Clearly, they knew how to do that. We can move marketplaces if we use the power of the purse. And states and municipalities, each of you have the power of the purse. You can change procurement rules. You can change how your contracts are run and how your subcontractees work, grantees work with you. The state of Virginia, the governor last year did a fantastic executive order that did just that. It impacted the way state government worked. It also impacted the purchasing at the universities and colleges. There are a lot of tools in our toolbox and a lot of tools in your toolbox to try to have an impact on moving markets in a more sustainable fashion. And you can incentivize those who move in that direction. That's the other thing to think about in terms of contracts. Those who are doing positive things, you incentivize those folks. Those who do harm, they're disincentivized, right? Also, clearly, as I said just a minute ago, reuse is a really important thing for us to think about. We need just to incentivize innovation and then incentivize those who are moving towards those places. Because of COVID, we saw some slippage away from some of the movement that we were going towards reuse. It is really important that we look at those regulatory oversight issues, especially in the public health space, allow for composting, allow for reuse, and allow folks to continue to innovate. A number of folks who are starting to build reuse systems and businesses were held back during COVID because of fears. I think we need to learn from what just happened over the last 2 years and really try to move as quickly towards reuse. And with that, I will stop and would love to have a conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Andrea, again, for that treasure trove of ideas and strategies that lawmakers can take. We're going to go ahead and open up the questions. I do want to start with one. We had a question in the chat from Lintarian, and I know, Sam, you gave a response, and thank you for that, Sam. But, Andrea, I want to see if maybe you want to take a crack at it as well. What would you tell children they could do to reduce plastic pollution?
Absolutely. I mean, we obviously get the honor and privilege to talk with children all the time at SHED and with all our aquarium partners. And this is a really great way. Use something that you can use over and over again. This feels like rocket science, but in fact, this is exactly what my mom and my grandmother would have done every day. And this is what I grew up doing, right? My house is full of ball jars. Amazing how kids can use them without breaking them. There are a lot of opportunities for folks to use things that are reusable. And I think that's one of the greatest ways they could do it. The other thing they can do is they can talk to other kids, and their parents can talk to their schools and their community centers, and then they can gather up things and they can talk to elected officials like those that are joining us right here. I think all of those laddering up things are possible for kids, and I've seen children do all of those things.
Other questions that we might have while we wait, I do have one. You mentioned, Andrea, your work with Senator Durbin's office and trying to address plastic pellets and coming from manufacturers and the pollution that goes into the Great Lakes. Could you give a bit of an update on where that initiative is? Because I believe I read, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that was maybe going to be part of the Build Back Better bill, but I know that that's kind of, been struggling a little bit. I don't know if there's been talk about, trying to break up the Build Back Better initiatives into like smaller bills. And I don't know if maybe that initiative was maybe going to be part of, that kind of strategy.
Absolutely, just having a conversation. So Senator Durbin's still interested. We're talking about the leadership on the Senate side and what vehicles we can use. So that's a very active conversation. Just had a conversation with Senator Lowenthal, who's also really interested, as well as some colleagues of mine in South Carolina, as well as Louisiana, also places where there's manufacturing, and local legislators there are also really interested. So we're going to try to revamp that and get it back up and going. Yep, that vehicle didn't work. That doesn't mean that we stop. We just keep going and we keep trying to find the best way for us to be able to move forward. We also wondered if there were some other larger bills, and we're just trying to make sure that we can move it forward. The other thing I just want to note on the purchasing side, also at the federal level in the United States, is Mr. Quigley, Congressman Quigley's plastic-free national parks bill, which is a procurement bill, right? It says that the plastic parks shouldn't be purchasing things like I was suggesting, the plastic water bottles or soda bottles, right? Changing those rules. It's not a big deal. It's not like rocket science, but it can have a really big impact. And it has an impact, as we can see, both on human health as well as on animal health. So we're hopeful about both of those things, and keep an eye out on National Parks Week, which is later in April. We're going to be doing a whole bunch more on that bill and really trying to push it across the finish line.
Another question that I had, you talked about, go ahead, Sam, please.
Well, I was just curious if you could say more, Andrea, about kind of what the bill entails with regard to plastic pellets, because it So I live in Erie. It turns out 10% of all plastics have some connection to Erie, Pennsylvania. It is a huge, I had no idea when I moved here, exactly how big the plastics industry here is. So I feel like I kind of moved into the belly of the beast. So I see plastic pellets in my litter boom collections. I see them, so I'm just curious, like what the bill entails.
Yeah, it empowers EPA to regulate pre-production pellets, just like any other toxic substance. And pre-production pellets, let us say, and Sam, you can express this better than I can, but they're not just petroleum. They're not just the polymer. They're also sort of coated with an amazing a toxic assortment of additive chemicals, and that makes them especially dangerous. So the bill would hold the manufacturers responsible for not letting those leach out of their care. That's in their care. I mean, it would be like motor oil leaching out into the right. It would be like paint leaching out at a paint factory. Right now, for whatever reason, there is not the kind of controls at the manufacturing level. I don't think there's a seriousness, and sometimes you need to regulate in order to get people's attention, and there needs to be a penalty for it. So that's what we're going to do, and this really should not be a source. This isn't going to fix everything, but boy, this one is fixable, like fixable yesterday. So.
Okay.
I don't know.
I didn't know if there were like if you knew of particular engineering, because I mean, they get lost a lot of times. I don't know how much our people know, but they're like vacuumed out, right? So as I drive to work, I pass every week, it's 30 new railroad cars. At the bottom of each railroad car are 4 ports. And then semi trucks come and they basically vacuum them out of those railroad cars into the truck. And then when they're taken to a facility, they're vacuumed out of that truck into a silo at the facility. And at each one of those places, pellets are lost. Now, the thing is that I know with their bottom line, it means nothing, right? It's thousands of pellets, but it's probably like pennies. They don't even notice, from a business standpoint, they don't notice the loss. But the ecology does. I mean, it's thousands of pellets that you see piled underneath these. I think
this is similar to, U.S. Steel is down the way from our aquarium, and every once in a while, a byproduct leaches out, right? It doesn't mean anything to them in terms of lost leader for production. It means everything to our drinking water. It means everything to the ecology. And there are solutions to ensuring that when it moves from point A to point B, you don't have that leakage. It just hasn't been a priority. And we have to
There's not a cost, right? There has to be a cost associated so that it changes their bottom line so that they care, Yeah. Sorry, I got us off topic, Derek.
No, you're
I just
totally
got really
fine.
Obsessed with the pellets because I see them all the time around here.
Well, hey, I said at the beginning, I wanted this to be very interactive and stuff. So no, that's perfect. Another question, Andrea, that I had, and again, for anybody, if you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand or put it into the Zoom chat. You talked about some of these international pacts that exist, and one thing that I saw, and as I was getting ready for this webinar, especially out of Canada, is this whole concept of building a circular economy. And I want to know if you could kind of speak to that, and especially if there's any Canadians on this call and stuff, what does that necessarily entail of this circular economy?
Yeah, I mean, part of this is really around, so one of the reasons why I was talking about single use is that one of the big problems that we've created out of the, as you looked at that wonderful, as Sam's beautiful, increase amount of plastic, that's much of that is because we've created an amazing assortment of things that we use once, right? And to become more circular and more sustainable, we need to be using things many more times and being very mindful about what the cost is in the production, not just in the waste, and looking at both ends of that. And we should be thinking about it in terms of energy. So that's the reason why I keep going back to climate, is that we have to think about what are we using, what types of things are we producing in the creation of the thing, how long are we using the thing, and then how do we deal with the thing at the end of life, right? And if if we know that production that uses petroleum and highly, it has a lot of carbon footprint and a bad toxic footprint, has a bad impact on human health and aquatic life and terrestrial life, and then we have an awful mess at the end, well, then moving us to a place where we're building things that we use that are more usable, that in the production causes less pollution and harm and uses and creates less carbon, then we have more sustainable world. And the circularness isn't just is about, partially it's like if I had a soda can, right? Like that aluminum can be reused many, many more times than the plastic, and it uses less carbon. But I'm talking about the sustainability side of this, because I think we often only look at one little part of the circle and part of the process, and we don't think about how it's all connected. And we are truly in a climate crisis, and part of the crashing and burning of our Great Lakes and in the wintertime and in the spring and the summer is we have much more extreme weather, right? Like I was thinking as Sam was talking that those little pieces of plastic are going to be crashed and burned a whole bunch more out there in the lake, not burned, but crashed around a lot because the waves are crazy. And we all know that we're having coastal loss. Well, that is caused by climate change. And the more that we can reduce both the toxic pollution problem and the production and come up with sustainable solutions that help our local economy. So again, we are in the breadbasket of both of our countries. There are people that could grow things and make things out of hemp, for example, or switchgrass that we could reuse and we could compost, and it could be back in a more positive way. And I don't know if Sam wants to talk in a different way about the circular economy, but that's often the focus I like try to lean in on.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Basically it's thinking about a product not as a linear scale, not we make it, we use it, we throw it out, but we make it, we use it, it goes back. We make it, we use it. So that's the circular economy. And so this can take on many forms. Andrea was just talking about, kind of basically bioplastics, I think is one solution, right? So actually, PLA is a good example, although for PLA, we need an infrastructure of industrial composting, because otherwise it's just a plastic and it doesn't go anywhere, right? So PLA, if you don't know, it's polylactic acid. It has natural, it comes from plants, but it can only biodegrade in an industrial composting facility. So if you throw it in your trash can, it's not going anywhere. It's, if it ends up in the lake, it's not any better, or maybe only slightly better than a polyethylene, cup ending, or polypropylene cup ending up out there. And so I think that's one solution. And I think some other solutions, when I think of PLA, I really think that would be a good use in, say, cars, right? I mean, I think there are places where plastic actually has made a positive impact. So cars are a lot lighter. And so as a consequence, they're a lot more fuel efficient, right? That's a good place. Like I can see, I hate stupid plastic is what I tend to say. And as Andrea pointed out, a lot of it is stupid plastic. It's the single use plastic. And there, I really think the focus needs to be less about a replacement, PLA kind of replacement, and more about something that is actually reusable. And there's a whole industry that can be built around that. So say that takeout containers, instead of being made out of plastic, are made out of stainless steel that are then returned and washed and reused. And there are companies that are starting to set themselves up. This has happened in New York City and of course out in California, right? Where they provide the materials to, say, coffee shops and restaurants. You return them anywhere. It's not like you buy a Starbucks cup at Starbucks and you have to return it to Starbucks. No, you can return it to Chipotle when you go for lunch, right? So they're just returned anywhere. The companies pick the stuff up, they wash it, and they're responsible for getting you the supplies that you need. And that's a whole new kind of industry that's built around this idea of circularity and less waste. and really kind of rethinking, reusing. When I talk about circularity in my classes, because I'm the sustainability director, so I talk a lot about sustainability and circular economies. One idea around circular economies that really blew my mind that I hadn't really thought about is light bulbs. And I was like, what, light bulbs? How do you make light bulbs in a circular economy? Well, they made the point that right now, the way that it's set up, companies only make money if they sell you a light bulb. So their incentive, Andrea was talking earlier a lot about incentives. Their incentive is for that light bulb to die quickly so that you have to go buy a new light bulb. If instead you rent the light bulb, right? They're constantly getting paid, almost like you have a Netflix subscription. You're renting that service. Now you flip the incentive. They want that light bulb to last as long as possible, because when they have to make a new light bulb, it's a cost to them. They have to pay for all of the recycling, the manufacturing, right? So now you've reversed the incentive. They're getting paid continually, right? And they want therefore their product to last longer. And they've actually done this in Europe.
And that's exactly, I'm 100% support that. And I think that's exactly the right direction. I'll tell you that we actually pre-COVID had 3 different companies in the Great Lakes area that wanted to move forward on the reuse side and with the retail side. And everything just crashed down. And the regulatory side, that's why I was bringing up public health, went in the opposite direction, right? So we need regulatory regimes that support this innovation. We need financial incentives to move folks in this direction. And it really does reduce a burden on local municipalities.
Yeah.
And I really do also just want to co-sign on the more industrial manufacturing using the PLMs, because I think that is where there is a real potential win. And because it's much more industrial and sturdy, and there could be a real interesting place there. And I really want to encourage us to think not about that use in the single-use replication, but rather this is a light piece of metal that could be replicated over and over again, and people are doing things like this. And that is the kind of solution we need in the more retail space.
Yeah.
But we need to incentivize those things, and we need to make sure we have regimes, policy regimes and incentive regimes that get the new businesses moving in that direction. And I swear to God, it's going to save on local municipalities. The money in, money out is going to be big. Once you can move people away from the amount of trash that they're creating on the retail space, you're going to have some significant wins. But we really do need to have really smart incentive-based policy solutions to be able to do that.
Yeah. And leveling the playing field. The policies really help to level the playing field so everybody has the same, kind of requirements, right? Yeah.
Let me open the floor one more time for any questions from anybody for any of our speakers that presented today, or any comments from anybody who maybe has been doing stuff in their own state or their own province to try and combat this whole issue about plastic and microplastic pollution to the Great Lakes system. It's a Friday, I understand that.
Andrea and I can just sit here and keep talking.
There you go. There you go. All right. Well, then we will go ahead and transition stuff to our closing. So again, thank you so much, Sam. Thank you so much, Andrea. And thank you, everybody who has joined us today. Like I said at the top, this was our final installment of our Great Lakes webinar series, which was going to just be an in-person meeting in January. But I think that actually was a really good idea that we were able to have this expand into a webinar series. We're really going to go in depth and really sink our teeth into these issues. So I want to thank you all again. This recording will be up on our website later on the Great Lakes legislators.org website. And then I also want to thank our sponsors who helped us put this series together as well: the Joyce Foundation, the Fred A. and Barbara A. Herb Family Foundation, and the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation as well. So thank you all very much for coming out. We're going to end up just a few minutes early today. If you do have any questions for us, just please feel free to email our office, the Council of State Governments Midwest, and we'll make sure to get them to the person that they need to go to. So thank you again so much, everybody, and have a good rest of your Friday and have a good weekend as well.